Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing the Sharks' 2020 draft plan. So, of course, with a normal draft pick, the Sharks would have had third overall in this year's draft. Unfortunately, during this past offseason, in the 2019 offseason, they ended up trading that first-round pick in the Erik Karlsson trade to the Ottawa Senators. This past regular season, however, the Sharks did manage to salvage that somewhat by picking up a first-round pick from another team. Unfortunately, that other team ended up being the Stanley Cup champion Tampa Bay Lightnings, and as such, the Sharks' first-round pick now this year is the lowest it could possibly be at 31st overall. So low, in fact, that just a few years ago, this wouldn't have even been considered a first-round pick at all. I guess sort of not really good news, but funnily enough, the Sharks finished so low in the standings that their second round pick is actually almost as high as their first round pick. So the Sharks have 31st and 34th overall in this year's draft. As such, I will be trying to predict what players could be drafted in these two spots. However, big asterisk there. You have to know that early on in the draft, if I was doing this for the third overall pick, there's probably only 3, maybe 4 names that could potentially be drafted third overall because there's such a limited amount of super elite players in every single draft. And so it'd be likely that I'd be able to get something like that correct. However, as you move down to 31st overall, there's a lot more variance in what teams are actually looking for, what players teams have actually scouted. And so even with a list of 10 players, it might be difficult to get both of the Sharks draft picks at that point nailed, especially with you never know which players are going to move up, move down for something like this, especially in such an exceptional year like this one. Also, another thing to say, all 5 players on this list are considered forwards. There's no defensemen here. There's no goaltenders. This is because I feel as though the Sharks should be aiming to target forwards. The 2 best young players in the Sharks system, in my opinion, at the moment are Mario Ferraro, who was already a rookie last season, as well as Ryan Merkley. Both these players are defensemen for the Sharks. They have Burns, Karlsson, and Vlasic all locked up long-term, which is half of their defensive core for the next few years. And so it seems as though, in my opinion, the Sharks could definitely use much more help at forward, especially when you take a look at the young players that the Sharks have in that area. I don't think any of them have a ceiling higher than, let's say, third liner, at least at the moment. And so the Sharks will maybe be looking for a bit more high-end talent. Obviously, that's difficult to find late in these drafts, but, you still have to try. First name on the list, Yanamizak from the Czech Republic, was looking pretty good for them. He came over to the OHL, the Hamilton Bulldogs, played a few games, also looked quite solid there before the season was cancelled. He's a player who is strong on the offensive side, also pretty good on the defensive side, sort of like a jack-of-all-trades style of player. Doesn't necessarily excel in any particular area. His skating is quite solid, his shot is pretty good, his offense in general is also quite solid, and so he could technically be a pick that comes, in the early 20s, but there were also a lot of these mock drafts that predicted that not only would he drop far enough for the Sharks to take him, but that the Sharks would indeed actually draft him. I believe there were 3 different mock drafts that I saw with Yanamizak as the 31st overall pick, so I ended up putting him on this list. Second, Ridley Grieg, or I don't exactly know how to pronounce the name, has one big factor for him that really a lot of teams like, which might make him go earlier on in the draft, is that he's definitely a player who sort of gives his 110% every single shift, plays a 200-foot game, is solid on the defensive side. His offense is great, but not very flashy or anything like that, so he doesn't necessarily have the skill ceiling to become a top-line forward in the future, more of a middling 6 style of player, but as I said, it definitely gives that effort, which a lot of teams really enjoy, so the draft interview might make it so that he ends up being higher in this draft, but could absolutely, just based on pure skill, drop down to where the Sharks could take a chance on him anyway. He does have factors that could make him a successful forward in the NHL in a couple of years' time. The next is Thomas Bordeleau, a player who has strong offensive capabilities. His defense is also pretty decent, though not that great. He's committed at the moment to play in college, so he absolutely will not be on the Sharks team next season. Most of these players probably wouldn't be on the Sharks team next season, but Bordeleau absolutely wouldn't because he has committed to that. He is a player who would definitely need a couple of years to develop, but the offensive game is somewhat there. He's a bit of a smaller player, so even though he is technically considered a center at this point, he probably plays in much more of a winger style of capability, which is why he could also be a solid fit for the San Jose Sharks. Definitely could use wingers on their depth chart, and he would technically end up being one of them. Could be a decent pick. Also, unlike the first two players on this list, he isn't necessarily a player who's that much in danger of going higher up in this draft, maybe in the late 20s, but realistically he will be available at 31st and potentially even at 34th. The fourth player here, and likely the most interesting one on this list, is Noel Gunder. He is sort of, I guess, a good description of him, the forward version of Ryan Merkley. He's said to have one of the best shots in this year's draft, if not the best shot in this year's draft. That's how hyped up that ability of his is. Sort of like a few years ago when people were saying Ryan Merkley was the best defenseman in that year's draft after Rasmus Dahlin. The main problem is that he's sort of not really interested in playing on the defensive side, and it's speculation, of course, but it's said that he doesn't have a very good attitude, which is the main reason cited for why he hasn't made it to any of these Swedish national teams, sort of like how Merkley never really made it to the Canadian national teams. And so he's definitely a player who could technically go higher up in this year's draft, maybe even close to the top 10, but he's also definitely a player who could drop significantly and be available for the Sharks to take at 31st overall. Now, of course, if Wilson feels like in the past few years that the development of Ryan Merkley in this system has gone well and he has improved not only in the defensive side but also just as a human being, he would definitely try and take a flyer on Gunder, and that could be a good choice. As I said, the Sharks looking for high-end offensive talent, and Gunder, if he can get some of these other extracurriculars figured out, he definitely would bring something like that, could potentially be a top-line forward within the next few years. And finally, Jake Neighbors at the bottom of this list, just a player who fits very well stylistically with how the Sharks like to play, sort of a power forward kind of player. He's pretty good offensively. He likes to go for those puck battles along the board. He wins those puck battles along the board, sort of like a Tomas Hertl style of player. He can get under the other team's skin while staying sort of towing the line in penalty-wise. He doesn't take too many penalties. And just a player who seems to be really built for a San Jose Sharks system. He's not someone who should be threatening going too high in this year's draft. It's very likely that he is available at 31st and potentially even at 34th. So if the Sharks want to pick someone who they know will probably be a pretty decent forward for them in the next couple of years, Neighbors is probably a solid pick and a safe pick at that. But that will do it for this draft target video. As I had said, it's very possible that the Sharks in their two draft picks there don't end up taking any of these five players. It's such variance can be happening, but I wouldn't be disappointed with any of these players on this list. Class dismissed.